similar areas of interest. And indeed, just before we were about to start and go live here, myself and Sarah and Imants were chatting away. And already, I felt, gosh, we've already got some immensely fantastic material here that we haven't even touched upon. And I'll just give you some kind of idea of how the ideas move. And Imants was mentioning about the way in which Madame Blavatsky used to cut up information, because I was looking at my notes here. And I have a piece of paper, and I have pieces of paper everywhere in my study. And I was getting the wrong questions. And Imants mentioned about Madame Blavatsky and her writing style, which then reminded Sarah of the fact that David Bowie used to cut out words and put them together in lyrics, which then reminded me of the minorly popular English band called the Heebie-Jeebies, who I think probably in the early 1980s brought out the most incredible album of music spoofing rock music at the time. For instance, one of the songs that I think maybe got vaguely into the charts was called Meaningless Songs in Very High Voices by the band called the Heebie-Jeebies. But they have other bands in and spoofs. For instance, they have a track called Dead Cicada by a band called the Beagles. And when I used to live in London and we used to have parties, I used to put the tracks in from there. And the amount of people that would turn around and say, God, that's an Eagles song I've never heard before. So check them out. They're very, very good. But it just goes to show how and where this conversation is going to go. Now, what I'd like Imants to do is very quickly just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what your intellectual interests and everything else as well. And then we'll get into some themes, and maybe from something you say in your introduction, I'll pick up on, and we'll run with that. So without further ado, Imants, welcome to INCON.
Hi, Anthony.
Hi.
It's so much fun to be back and to talk to you as always. Myself, I'll try to keep it short. I'm a professor of psychology at King's University College, which is a Catholic liberal arts affiliated college with Western University, one of Canada's largest universities, where I teach courses about consciousness, in particular altered states of consciousness. So this semester I'm teaching my big altered states class and a third year altered states of consciousness selected topics. And the topic I've chosen this year is death as an altered state of consciousness. So I love teaching. And so what I do is I write books for my students, and that's how Transcendent Mind came out. I needed a textbook for consciousness class. So Julia was kind enough to work together on that project with me equally. And that led to Transcendent Mind. And that's me.
Well, actually, funnily enough, that's a great start off, because one of the things you were saying before we went live was about how the classes are going at the moment in terms of the circumstances with lockdown and everything else. So tell us, how is that course on the altered state of consciousness, i.e. death? How is that going down, and how are you approaching it?
Well, I think the way that I structured all my classes with online teaching, after sort of reading all the pedagogical material and talking to my pedagogical advisors, we're very fortunate to have all kinds of help. I realized that the best thing to do is to put everything online for students to learn and for them to hand in weekly essays and that kind of thing so that they're engaged. And then for the actual classes once a week, just to have discussions with them, so that it's an opportunity for them to ask questions. It's an opportunity for them to raise issues or to ask for clarification about something they don't understand. But what's actually happened is that we've managed to get into very profound and deep discussions about all kinds of things that are related to consciousness. To a depth and a level. I mean, I've had that kind of depth and level previously in my classes when I'm standing there in person, but usually I'm also trying to cover particular material so that, we've got the knowledge base down. But now, because all the knowledge base is already, online and students can learn that asynchronously, these are really just opportunities to move more deeply into the material. And so it's just been really, really rewarding talking to my students.
What are your source books? Have you got any standard books that you're using as the source material?
No, that's the next book I'm writing.
Clever move.
Um, so it's a course pack. Basically, I've selected about 20 papers and chapters from other people's books, and I have them reading Fenwick and Fenwick's The Art of Dying. So that, along with about 20 papers and chapters from different books and journals and so on, about everything from ADC, ITC, NDE's theories about those, the nature of the afterlife. For example, David Fontana has a really nice chapter in his book about that, which I'm getting the students to read, so that kind of thing.
Okay, the David Fontana book is particularly good. I enjoyed that. Funnily enough, it was it was coincidental that David Fontana's book came out at a very similar time to my first book, and the covers were extraordinarily similar as well. And when David wrote the review of my first book for the Society for Psychical Research, he did comment upon that. I did find it quite wonderful, and it's still a wonderful reference material. You know, David was a very interesting writer, and a lot of his work is well worth going into. But one of the things that's always, what I like about your work is that you never abandon the science. You know, you're very much into the science. And as I recall, when we were having a conversation, you were telling me that you'd invested a considerable amount of time in making sure that you at least had an understanding of the mathematics of quantum mechanics. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just to fill in my background a little bit, I was in the Science, Technology, and Trades program in high school, and that sort of naturally streamed me into engineering. And so I was fortunate to be accepted into the engineering science program at the University of Toronto, where I did very well until I got to my second year and had an existential collapse. So I didn't understand the meaning of life, and so I left engineering behind. And tried to find a meaning of life, which sort of took me on quite a different route. And I mean, I did graduate from the University of Toronto. Then I spent 4 years as a roofer because people don't care what roofers think. So I was free to think where I wanted to. And then I came back to, I felt that I needed to work inside the system instead of outside. And so I decided to come back to school, and then chose to study mathematics in order to sort of establish my credibility. And so it took me 4 years to get my Master of Science degree in mathematics. And then I switched over to psychology and completed a PhD in psychology. So I'm a professor of psychology now. But on one of my sabbaticals, I felt that I needed to know. I started getting back into the quantum mind stuff, as your listeners might know. There are all kinds of people using quantum mechanics as a way of trying to understand unusual and non-materialist ideas about reality, and most of it is flimsy from an academic point of view. And I felt that if I'm going to get back into that, I really needed to know more about. I really needed to understand quantum mechanics a little bit better. So I went to, I was on sabbatical, so I didn't have to teach or go to meetings or anything. And so I spent one semester sitting in on an intermediate quantum mechanics course at Western, and became convinced that what I really needed was to know quantum field theory. I was advised not to try because it is too difficult. But at the University of Waterloo, which is just down the road from us, there was a professor teaching a senior level applied mathematics course in quantum field theory for cosmology, and I sat in on his lectures. I didn't miss a single lecture, even though I had to drive through snowstorms. Once, it was along the back roads. It was actually at the point where I couldn't stop the car, because if I stopped, I wouldn't be able to start it again, and nobody would find me out there in the middle of the fields. But he was able to make everything so clear. Like his thinking was so clear. He was so brilliant and so clear that I didn't have any difficulty following his presentation. And I had more difficulty doing the homework. I wasn't able to do all of it. I did maybe about a fifth of the homework, because in order to be able to actually do the mathematics, you need to know how to integrate distributions. You're not using functions at that point, but something more general called the distribution. And these are all ad hoc rules. And I hadn't taken the graduate courses in integrating distribution, so I couldn't do a lot of the homework. But certainly I was absolutely fascinated by the material. Really enjoyed it, and that gave me a little bit of an insight into what the actual mathematics behind quantum field theory is like, and maybe a tiny bit of credibility when I do talk about it.
Do you find people I know? I mean, I've tried desperately to try and understand matrix mechanics, for instance, trying to understand Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and we did discuss this, I know, recently. But in terms of having an understanding of some of the implications of the maths that underpins quantum mechanics, where do you believe that the people that are talking about the quantum mind theory and thing, where do you think they're going wrong? What is it that makes you feel that probably they need to think about it in a different way?
Well, I was at a number of years ago, I was at the Quantum Mind Conference at Salzburg University, and listened carefully to all the presentations. And basically the best way to characterize it is going madly off in all directions, to the point where, I think that some of them who are, the ones who are actually trained in mathematical physics and who understand, that aspect of quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, can understand other people's theories, but they are so, but they are just so all over the place. And I saw this at the conferences. It was very difficult for anybody to agree with anybody else about anything. So it's not so much that everybody's going wrong, it's that we don't know where we're going. Or it's just that everybody's going into a different place. Here's one way to think about it. In sort of physics or science more generally, you can think of something as being under constrained or over constrained. And if something is over constrained, it means that there is too much evidence bearing on it. It's more than enough evidence to show that something is the case or that it is true. And in that case, if it's consistent with all the other evidence, you're fine. You want to be over constrained in science, right? But you can also be under constrained, and you're under constrained if you don't have enough evidence for your theory. And all these quantum mind theories are under constrained. We don't know.
Right.
You can pin them into the same data set and get something completely different.
Which is crucial, isn't it? So in just so that I feel responsible that I've dived straight into quantum mind theory, and you and I both have an idea of what we're talking about, but of course there'll be individuals watching this thinking, what on earth are these guys talking about? So if you could just very quickly give us a quick run through the quantum mind theories, Hamerhoff, Penrose and various other individuals, just so that the guys out there, Précy, Hamerhoff and Penrose in 5 sentences. No, but just generally what we're talking about when we're talking about quantum mind theory. What is the challenges? Why is this such an interesting area?
Okay, I think a couple of prefatory remarks. One is that there has been, so basically what you're doing is you're going to the ideas and in some cases the mathematics and quantum mechanics and quantum field theory as a way of trying to conceptualize something else and move into some other area of understanding, such as consciousness, right? And so one of the things that people have realized is that they don't actually know the quantum mechanics and the quantum field theory. So but they still like to talk about things using some of the ideas from quantum mechanics. And so now this whole area has sort of developed called quantum-like phenomena. So we use the expression quantum-like. We don't say quantum, we say quantum-like. And then that drops the burden from the person who's trying to articulate this, from having to actually correctly get it to tie into real quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, because almost nobody can. So that's the first thing. And so there are now these conferences on quantum-like phenomena, and they come from all disciplines, economics or whatever, and say, oh look, here's something that looks like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, or the Pauli exclusion principle, or something like that, or complementarity. That's the big one. That sort of thing. So I think that's the first thing, that there's been this kind of understanding that it's really we're not really talking real quantum mechanics. We're just intrigued by these ideas. And so we're trying to apply them to other kinds of areas of inquiry. And so now we're calling that quantum light, which I think is really
so
helpful.
The idea is similar, say, the idea that within economics you might find that there's one factor and another factor that seems to communicate instantaneously, therefore it's entanglement, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, you pull the idea of non-locality out of quantum mechanics and apply it elsewhere, for example, or, undecidability, the interplay, like, between momentum and position, or, the more you know one, the less you know the other one. So I think that's the first thing. When you look at this historically, I think the Stuart Hameroff stuff is kind of, okay, so I sat beside Stuart Hameroff at a banquet at Cambridge University many years ago, just when he had sort of developed this theory with Roger Penrose, and I said that I would look at it carefully, and so I came back and I looked at it together with John Bell, who's a mathematician here at Western. We looked at it carefully, and we found we had so many issues with it that we thought it was a no-go. But I never had the heart to tell, Stuart, and I realized in retrospect I should have, but
well, let's hope
I've forgotten. I've forgotten the details.
Let's hope he's not watching the program then, and everything else.
Exactly.
I did give him a copy of my first book a few years ago, but I've never heard back from him. So obviously it underwhelmed him.
But I think that where people have usually taken this is they look at the idea of superposition, that when you look at a possible physical event and you look at the description for that event, you can write the description out as sum of sort of individual states. So as a collection of vectors. And so that collection of vectors would be called the state vector. So the state of the system at a given point in time. And so you say you have superposition. And then the question is, how do you get rid of the superposition? Why do we only experience the single reality? Where did the superposition go? Like, where did the other states go? And so this is called the collapse of the state vector. And so then you've got people saying, and this goes right back to von Neumann, that it's the transcendental ego, that there is some kind of, and by that he really meant it is not part of the physical system. It is something outside the physical system that chooses or that selects. Now, and one of my papers is about how you deal with those kinds of theories and where you end up with them and that kind of thing. But I think that that variation has so many issues with it as well. That first of all, if you look at background radiation, there are some theorists who have found that if you account adequately for background radiation, you can eliminate all the other states except for the one that actually manifests. And so there's nothing magical or mysterious about it. It's just that because nothing is ever an isolated system. There's background radiation. The background radiation basically kills the other states. And I just had there was a.
Oh, really? What? So the cosmic microwave radiation actually effectively collapses the wave function anyway?
I'm not sure it's the microwave radiation. It's
okay.
just the different types of radiation that are around.
Okay.
That can get rid of the other states. And I haven't looked at the details of that myself. I had a physicist send them to me recently, but haven't had time to go through them. So I mean, that's one way in which people say, well, look, this is another way of saying it is, well, all of those states just continue to exist. You just happen to be in the one that you're in. And that's the multiverse theory, which at one point was really favored by a lot of physicists. And then there's relational quantum mechanics, which is sort of similar to that, in which there is no collapse. You never have a collapse. it just kind of all the states just keep running. So and then that's sometimes these arguments for thermodynamics in order to try to shape things the way you want them to, and it all gets very, very complicated very, very quickly. So even that simple way of trying to understand things becomes very complicated. But usually when people think about this, like quantum mind stuff, that's what they go to. That's kind of like the prototypical way of thinking about it. That what that implies is that maybe the mind has a role to play in selecting the reality that occurs, and therefore, hey, look, that's how we can understand, PK, psychokinesis, or mind matter influence, that kind of thing. It gives us an opening to do that. And then there are all kinds of different variations on how that might actually happen. So Evan Harris Walker, for example, back in 1970s paper on how he conceptualizes this process working in the brain, for example.
Yeah, because his work was quite fascinating. And one of the things that you do so well in Transcendent Mind, I think, is that you really point out the major issues here with the idea of substance dualism, or the idea that in the world there are two things. There's mind stuff and there's matter. And the two of them don't seem to relate to each other. And in terms of this, we then have the issue of the classic model of Western science, which is material reductionism. And I know in that first chapter, you do a wonderful, almost demolition job of the materialist reductionist position in terms of this. And can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I've read it so many times, and every time I see different nuances in it. And it's so powerful because, it's central to an awful lot of the people that are going to be listening to this program at the moment and watching this program is, I am a conscious something existing in a seemingly physical universe. And yet my thoughts shouldn't have any kind of effect on the physical reality because they're non-physical. But they do. In some way, they allow me to move my hand because I have intention to move my hand, and it happens. And these are great mysteries. So what is your position in terms of the problem with the modern materialist reductionist model, if indeed you do see it as a problem?
Well, the modern materialist reductionist model is well past its best before date. It doesn't work. There are one of the things that Julie and I did in that first chapter was we laid out about 4 or 5 different definitions of materialism, right? And you can sort of look at each of those and you say, well, is this a theory and then, okay, so what you're doing in science is you're doing 2 things. You're looking at evidence, so it's an empirical inquiry. So this is evidence. These are experiences for someone ultimately. And you're gluing them together using logic. So it's a rational exercise, right? So it's a melange of empirical evidence and rational logic. And so the rational logic part, what are you doing? Well, you're creating explanations. You're trying to explain something. You're trying to explain what you see or what you find. So how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to try to match the elements of your theory to the data, right? And so for instance, in quantum mechanics, the theory has to match the results of actual experiments in subatomic physics, right? And this is why quantum mechanics has been touted as the most efficient or the best theory that physicists have ever had because of that match. And then quantum field theory came along and improved the prediction by about 3 or 4 decimal places, so that now quantum field theory is the best theory that physicists have ever had because of its ability to predict the outcomes of experiments. So now notice that says nothing about what the actual mathematical constructions say about the nature of reality. Because you can actually there's a mathematician at I think he's at Oxford who redid quantum mechanics using category theory instead of the usual tensor algebra that we use. Works just as well, but the mathematics looks completely different, right? So you can have different mathematical descriptions of the same theory. So the only things you need are those matching points have to match up. And so overall, that's what you're doing as a scientist always. You're going like, does my theory match the data? And so you go, what are the points that have to be matched? And then you go, does my theory do that? Okay, now I have a materialist theory. Does my materialist theory match what happened in a near-death experience? The fact that the chest of drawers moved 2 feet over with no one touching it. The fact, does it match that? And the answer is no. I mean, it doesn't get simpler than that.
Yeah, because it is, isn't it? It's the
so if it doesn't, then you throw it out. You start looking for something else, right? I mean, that's the logical thing to do. The logical thing is to throw out the materialism and look for something that will actually explain what it is that you're finding. And if you don't want to see the things that are actually happening, well, then that's confirmation bias. And it can degenerate into dogma so that you become dogmatic and you say, no, we can't do those experiments. No, we can't. We're not going to fund experiments on life after death because there is no life after death. Well, how do we know? We don't know. We just believe that there can't be because of our theory of reality.
Yeah, because it is, isn't it? I mean, it is crazy to find that there are these experiences that we know take place because people experience them all the time. And yet, because they don't fit in with the paradigm, they are just ignored. They don't fit in, so therefore they can't happen. So therefore we don't pursue them and we don't look at them in any objective way. And yet, of course, we do have the problem, don't we, of consciousness itself. Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, the idea of how does inanimate matter in my brain, which is effectively electricity reacting with physical particles, bring about me, bring about you, bring about everybody else that's out there. We all know we have an inner life. I've said many times, the frustrations I have with writers like Daniel Dennett, and you think, what on earth are you talking about? Of course there's an inner life. Of course there is. We all know it is. But you can't prove it, can you?
Okay. Well, I mean, he admits that. He doesn't have a problem with that. He says that qualia do exist. The qualia being the big. When you look at the hard problem, what is it that you really, really have to explain? We have to explain qualia. This is the felt sense that anything's going on, right? The experience component of experience, what I started calling existential qualia, the fact that anything is going on at all. That's what you have to explain. Dan Dennett doesn't have a problem admitting that that's there. But then he just automatically, and I've seen him do this in different papers that I've read and books of his. He just jumps the gap automatically. He goes from first person to third person. And goes, oh, okay.
Consciousness Explained. He does that so many times in Consciousness Explained.
I didn't bother reading it.
Oh, and the intriguing thing
about... by then, I had already read his other stuff by then, and it was already clear, where and how he did what he does. So, I mean, here's the really, I mean, just think about this for a minute. Again, logically, so don't forget, my background is in logic. So I'm a very logical person. So now logically, what have we done? We've created a notion of matter from which we have deliberately and carefully stripped every tinge of subjectivity or qualia or experience or anything. It is just inanimate, nothing with anything, obeys Newton's laws. If you push it, it'll move, but otherwise nothing will happen. Okay. So we've taken that and we've stripped away all of the any tinge of subjectivity, and we say, okay, now we have matter. Okay, the brain is matter. Oh, now we have to get all this subjectivity back. Well, wait a minute, you just finished removing it. How are you going to get it back? You can't. I mean, it's a completely idiotic exercise. You come up with a notion, that of matter, which is, it's just an idea. We just came up with it. We created it. and we strip it of anything at all that has to do with consciousness or mental events or subjectivity or anything of that sort, so that it's nice and clean. And then we say, okay, now this clean stuff with no subjectivity is going to give us subjectivity. Well, wait, you just very carefully removed all of that. How are you going to put it back? You can't. It's not there.
Because it's the idea, isn't it, that what is doing, when we do an experiment, for instance, who is the final arbiter that the experiment has been proven or disproven? And that is the observer themselves. And the observer makes a qualitative decision about the evidence that's given through experimentation. So when we talk about it's empirically proven, we're confusing our terms even, because of course empirical is from experience, and there has to be, it's axiomatic that from experience there must be an experiencer that is experiencing the experience. And of course we then get into some very deep philosophical
maybe
areas.
Not, but that's what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the ultimate arbiter. So if I mean, there are consensual experiences, right? So if you look through the telescope and I look through the telescope, we're probably going to not have any idea what we're looking at. So you're going to need an astronomer. Now, if you've got a properly trained astronomer looking through the telescope, another properly trained astronomer looking through the telescope, they'll probably agree on what they see, right? I mean, that's what you want. That's what you want. But now, if your subject matter becomes consciousness, which is my area of expertise, then how are you going to do that? Because what you're looking at is something that is a subjective event for someone. And this is why in that book that you held up, Transcendent Mind, chapter 7 is about how do you do that scientifically? How do you introduce subjective investigation? And basically then the answer is the investigator is the instrument. The investigator is the telescope. It is the investigator who's going to be looking, who's going to be, trying to use some form of introspection. So, chapter 5 in this book is all about, introspecting and changing the mind and radically transforming the mind and so on. But that has to do now with what do we know and how are we going to investigate what is going on subjectively or privately and still make that part of science?
And that is a huge challenge, isn't it? Do you think it's a challenge, or do you think that's solvable at any time? Could we ever solve
it's solvable. Well, of course it's solvable. I mean, I'm positivist, sort of. I mean, it's solvable. Okay, so let's take Weber's law. So this goes back to the 1800s, right? So I show a light in your face, and then I increase the intensity of the light, and I say, tell me when the light is brighter. You say, now. Oh, okay. That's a just noticeable difference. So I mark that down. I mark down the intensity of the light here, the intensity of the light there, and so on. And I keep going like that. Now I take participant number 2, and I do the exact same thing. And whoa, look at this. I get okay, I can't remember his Weber's law or Fechner's law, which is the logarithm, and the other one is, the log of the values, so you get a straight line. But anyway, the point is that you get a relationship between people's subjective experience and the objective world. And nobody thinks that there's anything wrong with that. So what you're doing is you're just extending people's ability to comment on what is going on subjectively for them.
That's a good point.
And this is the interesting thing. This is where they started in the late 1800s with psychology, and then that got killed by the behaviorists. And the behaviorists said, well, it's because people can't agree. That's what you see in the history books. But when people have gone back and looked at it, that's just revisionist history. It turned out they could agree.
Interesting, because one of the things
they just wanted to throw it out because it was too messy for them. They wanted to get on with something else, or whatever their agenda was. I don't know what their agenda was.
Yeah, because it was peculiar, wasn't it? That we had this whole cult of positivism, and within my field of interest, in sociology, we had Talcott Parsons and people like that, that were just desperately trying to be scientific, and in doing so, they throw the baby out with the bathwater in many ways, and Skinnerism,
they lose what science is. They lose what science is about. Science is an open inquiry. and you find the methods that you're going to need in order to investigate what you're interested in investigating. And this is what is so troubling, is that, you know, psychologists have spent so much time trying to emulate what chemists and physicists of the 19th century were doing, instead of coming up with their own methodology. And I've heard physicists say that, you know, like, you know, find your own methodology. Why are you depending on us?
Yeah, because there's one of the I can't, I've got the book now, but I should have actually pulled it out. There is a law that you mentioned whereby the idea that any civilization, you know, or believes that it's the civilization that's got everything right. And I can't remember what law it was, or somebody's paradox. I can't think now. Hibbert, something like that. Hempel's dilemma. Yeah. Can you just explain that? Because that really, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. So Hempel's he's a philosopher. So if suppose now that we think that physics has all the answers. Well, if we think that physics has all the answers, then clearly, you know, today's physics doesn't work, because physics has always been wrong in the past. We've always upgraded our ideas in physics. And of course, that happened, you know, with Newton's laws. Now, 1896 couldn't explain black body radiation, couldn't explain the photoelectric effect, for which Einstein got his explanation in 1905, got him the Nobel Prize in 1912. No longer fit, right? So that's one horn of the dilemma. If we're going to say it's today's physics, well, it's already wrong. So there goes that. And then if you say, well, it's going to be a completed physics someday, but we have no idea what that looks like. So that's promissory materialism. We promise that it will look like this, which is what some philosophers have done. And then they say, oh, no, wait. We're not actually telling physicists what to find. We're just telling you what they will find. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's
How
the
do
idea.
You know what they'll find? You're not even a physicist.
Yeah, it's the idea, isn't it, that somehow, as they say, you know, that we don't understand these things now, but we will be able to understand them. So therefore, stop even picking on these things. And I'm reminded here of, did you hear of the case of Brian Josephson in the UK a few years ago at all, and the stamps?
I know him, but...
Okay, Brian, as you know, Brian is one of the few living Nobel Prize winners in the UK.
We do talk about him in chapter 1.
Oh, right. Okay. Now, Brian...
Yeah, so we give the example where he was told not to come and give a talk because...
You do indeed. Yes, you do indeed. And he was told, wasn't he, you know, that you're going to cause problems even to the students who are going to be turning up, because
the students aren't going to be able to get jobs
because you lectured to them. Now, I had a fascinating. I had lunch.
You lectured to them, even if you never said anything about.
You just happened to be there. Just by your very presence, you've destroyed the career of all these individuals. I had lunch with Brian many years ago at a scientific and medical conference, and he was really enthusiastic. He had on his phone, he had an app trying to show telepathy or psi, and it was really interesting. He was very, very enthusiastic about this, and of course this was the problem he had. Now, as I recall, around about, 10 years ago or so, they were going to bring out a series of stamps, and the stamps were supposed to be having pictures of living Nobel Prize winners or historical prize winners. And, you know, they wouldn't allow Brian Josephson to be on there, even though he got the Nobel Prize for the Josephson Junctions. They denied him access to be on the stamps purely and simply because of his interest in telepathy. You know, it is just extraordinary how bad this scientism is getting. You know,
it's dogma.
It is, isn't it? You know, if it doesn't fit in with our belief system, it is ignored. And the evidence will be ignored. You know, the Darrell Bem work that he did, you know, and the, you know, the work that is done about the dogs thinking that their owners are coming home. This is very, very good stuff, but a lot of the reactions to it are really disingenuous. You know, they don't.
No, there is no serious reaction to it. I mean, I think like the quote unquote skeptics have been after the methodology in this type of research for decades. And so the methodology, like by anybody who's doing any one of these studies now, today, or in the last 20, 30 years, has to be impeccable. Otherwise, you're not even going to do it, because you know you're going to be chopped down at the knees before you get anywhere at all. And so for people to come along and say, oh, there must be some kind of methodological error, or, I can find the Bayesian model that shows you that they didn't find anything, which is what I couldn't stop laughing. This was at a Society for Mathematical Psychology conference that I was at a couple of years ago, one of the organizations I belong to, and there was someone up there who had produced a Bayesian model showing that if you added in a Bayes factor for, fraud and deceit, then you could show that there was no effect.
Jeez.
Going like, sure.
That is
sure.
horrendous.
Work hard enough. Bayes modeling. Gotta love it.
God, you've got to love the ingenuity sometimes, and you have. Going back then to what was it that was it something you'd experienced yourself as a young man that made you interested in this stuff? Because most of us have had that kind of road to Damascus sensation that something that you experienced doesn't fit in. Is that what happened to you?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying when I was in my second year at the University of Toronto. I had an existential meltdown. I couldn't figure out what the meaning of life was. I was going to kill myself. I couldn't understand what the point of continuing all of this was. It just seemed like a lot of suffering that was pointless. And then at that point, basically, that gave me permission to question everything. This is very Heideggerian, right? Sort of projecting upon your own death, so that if you realize that you're going to be doing your own dying, so you might as well start doing your own thinking. And so I just started doing my own thinking.
God, this is such good stuff. It's just so great. This already we're into Heidegger. This is just extraordinary. Okay, I'm just butting in there. Thank you. Continue.
So at that point where everything starts coming apart, well, of course, all the assumptions we have about everything here, there, and everywhere also come apart. And I think what really struck me was the last assignment I ask my students to write in the class usually it goes something like this: trace the development of your own understanding of the course material. And I'm also always interested to see how students change from the beginning of the course to the end of the course. And one of the students wrote something that really struck me, that stayed with me. He said, this is really interesting, because now I realize that consciousness has all these non-local properties. But I should have figured this out myself before I took your course. I should have already known this. I should have been able to figure this out. In other words, you don't need exposure to the evidence. The evidence is already out there. All you have to do is pay attention to it. And if you pay attention to it and you think for yourself, then you get to where you and I are, right? Mm. But if you simply keep listening to the dogma and you keep perpetuating dogma, then you're stuck. So I think that for me, that was the road to Damascus. Now, the other component of that was that I became interested in world religions through a strange, I had to write an essay in high school. And I didn't know which topic to pick. And out of the blue, I thought, I know nothing about the world religions. So I picked the world religions. And so I read Houston Smith's, the Religions of Man, or Great Religions of Man, or whatever the first version of it was called. And I was just fascinated by these mystical states of consciousness. And so the two came together, this interest in mystical states of consciousness and this deep questioning and undergirding, sort of completely removing the ground for the way I was supposed to think and starting to do my own thinking. So those two things came together. And so as I investigated mystical states of consciousness and meditation and those kinds of things, of course, I came across all kinds of anomalous phenomena.
The anomalous phenomenon you came across, was it, presumably you read about it rather than witnessed it, or was there something more to that?
Well, Do you know Douglas Baker?
Name rings a bell. Name rings a bell. Tell me more.
British occultist.
Yeah.
In 1974, just when I graduated from the University of Toronto, Douglas Baker had organized an international festival of esoteric science and yoga that ran for a week in Toronto. And so for some strange reason, I went to that. And this was like the ultimate circus event with 20 sideshows going on at once. I mean, there was everything from films of, mediums producing ectoplasm to guys with wands walking along the floor of the Royal York Hotel in Toronto, pointing out where the water pipes are, dowsing, to people talking about homeopathy, to, people from Findhorn there, talking about their New Age community, it was just like pyramid power, you name it, it was there. And so it was kind of like going like, oh, this is interesting, and of course, always a skeptic, you don't buy into it necessarily, but you have exposure. And then as you have exposure, you start sort of going down those different routes and seeing, well, what's there? Like how much of this checks out? How much of it doesn't check out? That kind of thing. And so in that sense, I started early, even into all these anomalous phenomena. And have obviously, as my career developed, formally, started looking at them. So for instance, right now I have a student who's looking at after-death communication with cell phones, like getting experiences of people with, who appear to be hearing from, their loved ones on their cell phones. So, now we're doing formal experiments that deal with anomalous phenomena. And I've got, we just have a couple of students who did some reg experiments showing that love seems to be, or we think it's probably love that's helping the reg to move in the intended direction. And so that paper is in press right now for the Journal of Scientific Exploration. We're another student writing up another paper. We took people who are diagnosed with late life depression and had them interact with the reg. And we anticipated that they would go opposite to intention, and that's what we found. And the student who did that is writing up the paper now for publication. So now I'm doing formal experiments about those kinds of things that I was interested in back then.
That must be very intriguing to do. Was it Donna that we had the mutual contact that in terms of the telephone calls? Was that you I was talking to about that? Was that somebody else? Donna Hogan?
Donna Hogan?
Yeah.
I just had her as a guest speaker in my class.
Really, that is so extraordinary because Donna's been in this house,
so cool.
And when we've discovered that, because extraordinarily, I cited one of the incidents that she reported to me when I wrote the book with Irvin Laszlo, whereby she had her brother-in-law, I think it was her brother-in-law was killed in a lorry crash out on the outskirts of Liverpool.
Yes, that's right.
And that the phone was destroyed, his cell phone was destroyed, but she subsequently received a message on her home phone from him, from that phone, date stamped after he died. And that was extraordinary. I couldn't even begin to quantify how extraordinary that was. Incredible.
Yeah, well, so exactly. These kinds of things go on. And then she said, she called the telephone service and said, there's some mistake. You obviously got the date stamp wrong or something. And they said, no, it's date stamped using an atomic clock. It's not wrong. And then she told him what had happened. And he said, yeah, you're not the first one that I've heard this sort of thing from. So, that stuff goes on all the time. It's just that, the walls of the academy the walls of censorship around the academy are so thick that it doesn't make it inside the academy, right?
Yeah, because this is it, because Donna has done an awful lot of interesting work in terms of EVP as well, and some of the work she'd done, some of the recordings she'd made, I think, at a place called the Arthur Findlay College in Essex, because I've been involved in a couple of events there, and again, extraordinary some of the sounds and things. Sarah, have you got any comments to join in here at the moment, at this stage? Have you got any observations or ideas?
Yeah, there was a few things that sprang to my mind about how the scientific community might change in the future with regards to their serious acceptance of the study of consciousness and this sort of anomalous phenomena. And one of them is, I think, psychedelic science kind of having a renaissance at the moment and research in that area. The other one is the kind of scientific research involving dreaming, and potentially two-way communication in dreaming has become quite a regular scientific exploration recently. And also, I think longevity science might have a really big impact, because I was just writing earlier about the mysteries tradition in the ancient world, and when Imants, you were talking about world religions, I think that there's something of the mystery initiation that brings to my mind this idea of a kind of sanctified midlife crisis, where you're held in a safe space and you're allowed to have this reflective crisis, ego collapse experience, and it's ritualized and there's a framework that supports you, and so you're able to kind of feel like you can safely release that sort of structure that you've had previously. And I think that with longevity science, people will be able to go far beyond middle age and will have more time to reflect upon these things, and perhaps that will improve the research that we have, because actually few people come to this stuff until a bit later in life often.
Interesting point. Yes. Imants, have you got an idea, any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I agree that all these things are happening. I'm a pessimist, so I'm not sure if there will be some kind of global shift or not in science. I know that, like, for Julie and I, the whole purpose of seeing if the American Psychological Association books would publish the book was precisely to give people inside the mental health profession and the psychological profession get this information inside the system instead of just being outside, in an effort to try to normalize it. So I think that it's not clear how well that's working.
How did you manage?
See, the other thing is that practicing psychologists don't have an issue with this. It's typically the academic psychologists who do, or I shouldn't say. Obviously, it depends on the person, right? But they see a lot of this stuff, right? They see a lot of odd things happen, so they know that odd things happen. I mean, I was invited to give a talk to the Canadian, what are they called? I don't remember what they're called, but they're medical psychotherapists. So these are people who are physicians who do psychotherapy. And they had a annual conference in Toronto, like I think it was a year ago, and no, 2 years ago, just before the COVID. And they invited me as their guest speaker. So I just blabbed for an hour and a half, and they're going, yeah, I've seen this. This happens to my patients. I've got messages from my grandma on my phone. I've got, I use those healing techniques. I use them on my patients. They work. I was like, okay.
Because this is. Go on, Sarah.
I was just going to say, placebo is one of those areas. The placebo effect is recognized, and yet the extraordinary nature of that really kind of underlies this idea of thoughts and feeling having a entangled relationship with the material world that seems to be overlooked somehow. But the placebo effect, I wonder whether that may be something that opens people's minds to this idea of that kind of entanglement.
It is. I think that there is more research on why the placebo works, and an effort to try to see if we can create that cognitive sequence in people's minds to get it to work and use it as a therapeutic, right? Instead of just as a control for drug trials. So there is research around that now. Yeah.
Because
yeah, I mean, I think I'm hoping that, you know, there will simply be so much accumulation of evidence, and that the people who are moving these programs forward in the positive direction, there are, I think, more of us now than there were in the past, that eventually, like the evidence, I mean, you know what they say always, evidence speaks for itself, which of course doesn't mean anything, but it's kind of like, eventually it's like you can only hold up a particular mistaken version of reality for so long, and then at some point the facts take over, and depending upon how deeply immersed you are in whatever cult it is, you know, it can take longer, more time or less time, and you might fight and struggle more than you might in other situations. But eventually the facts, I think, will out, and hopefully they will out, you know, at some point in science.
Well, it's one of the things I was very interested in, your point you were making there about academic, that is institutionalized researchers in psychology and psychiatry, and those that are out in the field applying psychology to real people. And a few years ago, I worked for a year at a local residential school for children that had either autism, temporal lobe epilepsy, and various other neurological problems. And I used to spend fascinating hours chatting with the professional psychiatrists and the psychologists that work there. And it was the point you were making there. They regularly turn around and said, oh, we witness extraordinary events on a daily basis. We see precognition. We've witnessed telekinesis taking place. We know that a lot of the children seem to have abilities to understand things that we don't know what channels, how they're doing it. Now, to me, this is powerful evidence that you can't just ignore these things because they don't fit in with your paradigm. You know, it's bad science, you know, to do this, because, you know, as the whole idea of the white crow, you know, the idea you just need one anomaly to make you question everything. And, you know, the time and time again, and there was one thing, I did a debate with skeptics a few years ago. And afterwards, I went for a beer with a couple of them. And when the beer start to take in, and they'll turn around and they'll say, oh, yeah, no, what you talk about is nonsense. And then you wait for it. And there's always going to be, but there was this thing that took place. And they will tell you this tale, whatever it is, about something they could not explain. And my response is always the same. It's always, well, why don't you talk about this at your university? And the reaction is always the same. The reaction is, I need to have security of tenure. I cannot say these things. I can say them when I retire, but I cannot say them now. And this is an atrocious state of affairs. It really is. Just very quickly, somebody called Aaron Lomas has made the point about Rogo and Baylis's phone calls from the dead, and also mentioned about Cal Cooper's work on telephone calls from the dead. And Dr. Cal Cooper is a previous guest on this program, so it's nice to see that reference there as well. So let's move on a little bit now to your particular writings. There's an area I'm particularly fascinated with, and you touch upon it in Transcendent Mind, and it is the near-death experience, and particularly elements of the near-death experience such as the panoramic life review and the slowing down of time. And I thought if you could tell us a little bit about your angle on these things and on the near-death experience, and we'll take it from there and see if we get some responses.
Well, I actually have a PhD student writer or PhD about near-death experiences. She's pretty much finished. She just sent me her conclusion yesterday. Well, I mean, near-death experiences are one type of anomaly that really challenges materialist versions of reality and maybe helps us to understand what our true nature is. They're typically enigmatic, even for the people who have them. It can take people time to sort of sort them out and to try to frame in our words and sort of into a narrative logical structure what it is that happened to them. So I think that when we when we try to characterize exactly what these experiences are, it's not actually. I think it's tinged with a lot of interpretive imagination as to what we think that it must have been like, because it's very difficult to actually, and I've heard this from people who've had these experiences, of how difficult it is to try to convey what happened. Let's see, what can I say about them? I think that there are a couple things. I think that what really strikes me about the life review, that some of these people have a replay of what happened in their lives, or what appears to be what happened in their lives, and sometimes it goes on into the future as well, not just the past but the future. And there are variations on this. For some people it's more detailed, for other people it's less detailed. Some people can edit it. They feel they can stop it. They can pull it in. They can zoom in on some particular aspect of it and correct it, and then zoom back out. So there are different different variations on it. But what strikes me as being particularly profound, perhaps, is the fact that these experiences are often as real, seemingly real to the people who have them, as the experiences they had when they were actually living them. In other words, it's like living your life again. And this kind of makes you wonder, so what is this living your life again? Like, is that what we did the first time? Like, is it that different? Right? Now, of course, one of the issues you can raise is, well, maybe feelings of reality aren't really a good measure of whether something is real or not. Right? I mean, it feels real to you, but it's just a delusion. Hey, get over it. But of course, that cuts both ways. Then what is the ordinary waking state? We have feelings of reality in the ordinary waking state. Get over it. This is just a delusion, right? So if you apply that argument, this isn't real either. So at a minimum, what it does is it forces us to question what is real and what isn't real about what it is that we're doing when we live our life. I think probably the second comment I want to make is just that there is now an increasing number of cases of people who are clearly have no brain activity at the time when they accurately see things that are happening in the room around them or in the nearby vicinity. We've had those anecdotes forever. With the advent of resuscitation technology in the 60s, the number of NDEs reported has just ballooned. And so there are people who say, yeah, I saw the nurse break don't do that, honey, don't break the glass like that. You'll cut yourself, because she had broken the neck of a vial, and you're supposed to use like some kind of like a paper towel or something so you don't cut yourself. And then her rush to break it, she broke it with her bare hands, and the person who was being resuscitated saw that in the next room. It is one of Raymond Moody's examples. So we have more and more and more and more and more and more of those. And we have more and more and more and more of those by credible, reputed surgeons who have evidence, the actual evidence from the machinery that the person was attached to, that they were not alive during that time by any reasonable definition of being alive. And that this happened 20 minutes after, or 15, 20 minutes after they were pronounced dead. So then you have to say, well, wait, how would they be able to see any of that? How would they be able to encode that in memory? How would they be able to know what that information is? And the only other real explanation is post-cognition. So basically, they're remote viewing the events afterwards, after they've awoken from, whatever it was that happened to them. But either way, the cat is out of the bag, right? But but that seems a somewhat tortured way of trying to explain what to them appeared to be an actual experience. And so and that's just one of the types of evidence, but I think perhaps the clearest evidence that that consciousness does not need the brain. And so, in fact, that's what Julie and I, in one of the chapters in the book, like we reviewed that evidence. Like, is there evidence that consciousness can exist without a brain? And the answer is, in particular, in some of these near-death experience cases, that seems to be true, and the number of those cases keeps growing. I think the third thing I wanted to say is there was a group in Germany who decided to do an experiment running a simulated near-death experience. So what you do is you basically created a guided imagery exercise for a person, and in addition you use these lights. So you kind of shine lights in a person's face and you make them brighter or dimmer, so to give them the impression of going through a tunnel, that kind of thing. And what they did was, what they found was that you could get some of the benefits of a near-death experience. And so one of the benefits, if you want to call it a benefit, is that people often have a reorientation of their understanding of reality. Like they're changed. Some of them are profoundly changed, some not so much. Some of them are profoundly changed. They're no longer afraid of death. They think they know where you go when you die. They think we got it all backwards. They think that, the physical world is, and the real world is, something else. And so what they did in this experiment in Germany was they simulated a near-death experience, and they found that there were some of the same elements, same consequences. So one of my former students who's had a near-death experience, so she set that up. We came up with a protocol, and she brought in all these lights. And we did that with the Conscious Club, like all the members of the Conscious Club sat there, and she led us through this simulated near-death experience, and people had very deep and profound experience as a result of the simulation. So I think that I mean, those are the comments that come to mind sort of immediately when you mention near-death experiences. Like as I said, this year, my third year course, is the selected topic is death. But the first time, a couple of years ago, the first time was near-death experiences. So after 13 weeks of talking about nothing but near-death experiences, we still hadn't managed to get through. Like we managed to get through maybe about half of what I had hoped to get through in that course. So you can imagine if we start talking about them that we can talk for a long time.
Because that's the whole fascination of the subject. Now, Søren and I have worked with, I don't know if you're aware of the work of Engelbert Winkler and Dirk Prokol at all. Have I mentioned these guys to you?
No.
Okay. Engelbert Winkler, funnily enough, I met Engelbert Winkler through Evelyn Vallerano, the lady that wrote this book that we were discussing earlier on. And it was Engelbert Winkler is a friend of Evelyn Vallerano, the NDE researcher, who, funnily enough, I first met at an event that Bill Murtha, who was the previous guest or an earlier guest on this show, who had the most profound near-death experience. And you really need to check out on that in Imants. It's really quite fascinating. He has a panoramic life review. He goes back in time. He actually has an experience whereby he perceived the trauma of somebody who hit him as a child in a car accident. Very, very interesting. But going back to the work of Winkler and Prokol, Winkler had a profound near-death experience when he was a child and stimulated him to become a consultant psychologist. And he came across my first book, Is There Life After Death? And it so fascinated him, the angle I was taking on near-death experiences, that he said that he was very keen to meet me when I was doing an event at Crête Baronde in Switzerland a few years ago, about 12 years ago, 13 years ago now. And he invited himself over to Evelyn's house. And he brought with him his friend Dirk Prokol, who is a fellow Austrian, and he's a consultant neurologist. And these two guys have invented this machine they call the hypnagogic light experience, Lucia is the nickname for this machine. And I was one of the first people to test it. They brought the prototype over. And the experience was quite extraordinary in that it definitely works on some form of neurological level. It seems to generate either phosphines or claviform constants within the brain. It brings about a tunnel effect and everything else as well, which is quite extraordinary. But what we did was a few years ago, well, 2 years ago, nearly 2 years ago, Sarah and myself and the Austrians, together with an associate of Sarah's who's going to be a future guest on this show, Carl Smith, we did a full event of recreating Plato's cave there. And we had some quite intriguing reactions, and people who have used the Lucia light device always liken it to the sense of almost being pulled down a tunnel, like it's reproducing the near-death experience. And I suspect that what's taking place here is in some way it's generating endogenously generated dimethyltryptamine within the brain in some way or other, either synthesizing melatonin into DMT. I'm not sure of the synthesis here. But it'd be very interesting to link you up with these guys, because I think what you're doing and what your researchers are doing and what they're doing is of interest. Sarah, would you agree on that?
Yeah, I think so. But I also wonder, like, the impact that culture does have on our perception of reality, because it's only been quite recently that we've decided that there is no life after death. And that's only in the Western world. In other areas of the world, people will still talk to the ancestors. They still believe in life after death. And I just wonder why we stopped thinking about it, and what science was there that was ever able to prove that death is the end of consciousness and our experience.
Well, I always wonder whether
it's called arrogance.
Yeah. But it's also difficult. It's to prove a negative. And I have to say that the skeptic in me says that there was an awful lot of charlatanism taking place probably at the end of the 19th century with mediumship and everything else that probably made people feel a little bit ill at ease about it. And I think what always happens is, isn't it, that you get the snake oil salesman getting involved, which sort of muddies the waters, which makes people worried. What do you think about that, Imants? Would you say that is a reasonable analysis?
I think trying to track what the variables were is really, really difficult. I think the whole idea of the Renaissance and putting sort of logical thinking on a pedestal, becoming very, very good at it, inventing universities, and what you do in universities is rational thinking. And obviously, I'm not against that or against logic, because I love logic, I love mathematics, I love thinking rationally. But to think that is the only way to approach something, or that somehow proves that nothing else can happen if it's not happening rationally in front of somebody on a sheet of paper, then it's just silly. But I think that was just that momentum. I did want to say one thing though, be careful with the DMT. The body does not have the ability to create enough dimethyltryptamine to create psychedelic experiences. Right. It doesn't have the capacity to do that. That is one of the, DMT has been posited as one of the surge agents. Okay, so basically the dying brain hypothesis for NDE says that as the brain dies, it produces near-death experiences. And you can very quickly show that that's not possible. And one way you can show that that's not, one of the pieces of the argument is that, well, the brain is dying, it's not active. And the answer is, well, there's a surge of activity in the brain as the brain is done, which we haven't found, but it must be there. Well, how is it going to surge? Well, because it produces dimethyltryptamine, and that creates these psychedelic-like experiences that a person has during near-death experience. And the answer is no, the body is not able to produce dimethyltryptamine in the amounts required for psychedelic experiences in the first place, and certainly not within a few seconds. But
the interesting thing is wasn't the surge discovered in terms of rats' brains by Jimo Borjurgian at the University of Michigan in 2017?
No.
Good.
No. It's as I like to address that, it's too little too soon.
Go on. Interesting. Tell us more.
I don't remember exactly what they found, but what happens is that the neurons in the brain are hyperpolarized, So they're like at minus 70 millivolts inside relative to the outside of the cell across the cell. So there's an active process across the cell membrane that keeps the sodium and potassium ions where they're supposed to be, right? And what happens when there are these microbiological processes that continue to take place after a person has been pronounced dead. So you pronounce a person dead when there's no heartbeat, and there's, or when there's clearly insufficient brain activity for the type that would be required to have consciousness. And then there's all this stuff that goes on in the brain afterwards, with stuff still chugging around and starting to decay. And this is a big issue in transplantation, right? Because you have to transplant as quickly as possible because there's a buildup of toxins in the body, and the organs become less and less viable the longer you wait. And so, you want to get the organs out as quickly as possible. At the same time, you don't want to, to seem too unseemly. So this is a real issue. But basically, one of those processes that happens is that the membranes of the neurons can no longer sustain the hyperpolarization. There's no metabolism energy left in them to do that. And so when that happens, they release the ions. There's an ion exchange.
So it's an ion.
That's what you're picking
right.
up. It's an ion exchange across the membrane, which results from the fact that the neurons are no longer working. That is the best explanation that people have come up with for that particular phenomenon. When you look at the other research where, you've looked at someone who is, and that's work by Adrian Owen and also one of my colleagues in my department, the fantastic Loretta Norton, looking at brain activity after a person has been pronounced dead. But I've had her come and talk to my classes, and we've looked at all those graphs and that sort of thing. And nobody's suggesting that tiny amount of brain activity ever reaches the point where it could be regarded as being conscious or anywhere close to being conscious. It simply does not have the power. It doesn't have power now in the technical sense of what you're looking for in a brainwave. It's just not there. It's minuscule compared to what you need in order to actually have any experience going on in the brain. So those arguments are
that is fascinating. That is fascinating to hear, because I haven't read any converse points of view on the Bourdieuian findings. In which case, one of the things you mentioned before, which I have great personal interest in here now, is then the statement you made that the brain couldn't synthesize sufficient DMT to cause hallucinogenic experiences. So the argument that, again, Bourdieu discovered DMT in the pineal gland of live rats, and I presume the argument is that it is synthesizing in someone from melatonin. What your argument is, and your point is, that however much it could produce, it wouldn't be sufficient to cause altered states of consciousness, correct?
No, these are trace amounts. These are trace amounts. They're not substantive. They're not substantive enough to do anything. And this is the person who has looked at this carefully. His last name is Nickel, and I don't remember his first name, but certainly I reference that article. I think in my book Alterations of Consciousness, which came out in July.
Okay, I need to read that for completion's sake, because one of the things I do as a writer is I make sure that when I make statements that they are technically correct. And I know I've cited on many occasions in previous interviews the Bourdieuian evidence, two cases, and I need to be careful then. I need to make sure.
I just saw that in one of your books, and I was going to tell you about it, but then I thought.
No, it's important. I pride myself on being right. Not being right, sorry, that sounds terrible. I pride myself in making sure that I'm up to date as I possibly can. I don't make glib statements, and if it's been disproved, that's really, really interesting. Because again, as Aaron has just pointed out, a mutual friend of Sarah and I, Pascal Michael, which I think, Sarah, you know as well, don't you? He's recently published a paper in Paranormal Review, which literally I read yesterday, about citing these cases as I've done myself. So it's profoundly important that we really have the correct evidence here, because we know that the skeptics out there will just destroy us unless we are right in what we talk about. Now, one of the other areas you pointed out, which again always intrigues me, and again a previous guest on this show, we had Dr. Penny Satori talking about her research on veridical experiences during NDEs and during cardiac arrests. So what do you think is taking place there? How is consciousness working? How is it possible that consciousness can in some way perceive and receive information from outside of the brain when they are effectively flatlined? What do you think is going on there?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is that it wasn't in the brain in the first place. It attaches to the brain. And this is what, Sir John Eccles is trying to say. This is what Roger Penrose, sorry, Roger, I don't mean to pull you under. Although you might, I think he might agree with this as well. Sorry, I'm thinking of the Canadian neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield.
Oh, Penfield, yes.
Wilder Penfield, who said that the mind is not in the brain; it connects to the brain through such and such mechanisms. And they have different mechanisms. Like I've heard Sir John Eccles talk about his mechanisms, and I've read Wilder Penfield's book, The Mystery of Mind. He talks about his mechanisms. So I'm not aware of what they think their mechanisms are, but their point is that the mind is not in the brain in the first place. It attaches to the brain in particular kinds of, and of course then you have like the Evan Harris Walker, system of attachment, and then you've got Henry Stapp's system of attachment, which now combines the collapse with with Evan Harris Walker stuff too. How there might be control. Anyway, so I think that the idea of the double, like that back to the old esoteric traditions that, this is a meat jacket that we're wearing for a while, and then, we get rid of it and move on. And so we're not this thing, we're just driving it. We're just consciousness. The consciousness that we experience through the brain is only one form that consciousness can take when it's actually trying to operate this machinery, which is our body. And at other times, when it's not in the machinery, it's out there. And if you wanted to go, well, what could that look like? Well, that could look like non-local consciousness, like remote viewing and remote influencing. Hello, like we've been there. We've been around the block. We know that, those kinds of things happen. Well, they're not happening with the physical brain, probably with whatever the qualities of the double are that allow for that kind of thing to happen, to have that kind of access to non-local, those kind of non-local properties or non-local traits.
As a personal opportunity here, because one of the areas I'm in the process of writing up for my new book is to dig into more detail about the John Lorber case. Do you know the idea of Lorber and the young man that had water on the brain, and that he managed to get a first-class honours degree in maths, but they subsequently discovered that virtually 95% of his brain was missing and was actually liquid. Do you know, A, do you know about that case, and B, do you know if there's been any subsequent work done on that? Because I'm finding it quite frustrating that it's the case seems to go very cold.
Julia and I made the decision to leave those studies out of the book.
Interesting.
On purpose, because of the sort of attention that it might draw those children, and so for the sake of those children's parents, not to use those cases in the book. But yes, the research done by John Lorber showing that there are what we call anencephalic children, like in other words, the cephalus is missing, or hydrocephalic children, where much of the content of the skull is made up of water. Cerebrospinal fluid with not much cortex left, or never was. So how are they able to do this? And this suggests that, now, first of all, you have to realize that it's only a minority of the children with this type of condition who survive, right? And who are able to do this. but you bring that in also with the notion of terminal lucidity, that there are people whose brains have been destroyed by Alzheimer's disease or meningitis or anything, whatever. And then, like, at some point before they die, and this could be a year and a half into their disability, where maybe they've been mute for a year and a half or whatever, and they sit up, recite a poem in Icelandic, recognize their son, talk to the son, fall over, die sometime later. So where did that terminal lucidity come from?
Can I jump in here? It's very important I jump in here, because I have witnessed that with my own mother. Very, very peculiar set of circumstances whereby my mother was in terminal decline with Alzheimer's, and she was in a home, and she hadn't spoken for around about 2 or 3 months. She'd almost been semi-catatonic. And one evening I get a phone call from the home, and it's one of the nurses in the home, and I could hear my mother screaming in the background. And they said, we need you to calm your mother down. She's in a state of hysteria. So I spoke to my mother, and she goes, "Oh, Tony, is that you?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, I'm not having this. And I'm thinking, where's all this language coming from? And she turned around and she said, "They kidnapped me. These people have kidnapped me. I was sitting watching Morecambe and Wise with your father on television, and there's the exact word she used. She said, I closed my eyes to have 40 winks, and I opened my eyes, and I'm in this place with these people. They've captured me. And when your father finds out, we're going to sue them." And I said, "Mum, you're in your 90s. Look at your hands." And she said, "I don't need to look at my hands to know that I've been kidnapped." And then I said, "But Mum, Dad's been dead for years." And she said, "No, he hasn't. No, he hasn't." And then she turned around and she said, "You're not my son. You sound much older. My son's in his early 20s at university. You're not my son. You're in on this as well." And she slammed the phone down. They phoned me back, and I spoke to her again, and I calmed her down. And it seemed to, and then they gave her sedatives. And then she then declined, and she never really spoke after that. And then she eventually died. But the intriguing thing is imagine a scenario that could it have been she was experiencing some form of past life review, whereby she literally was back in the past or had jumped into the future. So almost like terminal lucidity or Pekindarian experiences. This was something, again, I witnessed, and it was inexplicable, because in the UK television, Morecambe and Wise, she was back in 1974. Very, very strange. Sorry to jut in, but I just felt it was important I made that point.
See, what those kinds of cases suggest to me is that there's a secondary mechanism by which the mind is connected to the body. There's a normal mechanism that we all use in order to get our lips moving, to say what we want, get the brain, the right parts of the brain to do what the right parts of the brain need to do in order to, display the behavior we need to display, and so on and so forth. But there's a secondary mechanism, and my guess is that that's the same secondary mechanism that people who can produce PK effects are using, because that's a PK effect. That terminal lucidity is a PK effect, and you either know how to do that or you don't. And some people, as they approach death, who have this terminal lucidity, somehow are able to switch on that ability. Not everyone can, and they can't do it all the time, but they can do it for a tiny bit of time. But I'm wondering whether some of these anencephalic children can do it all the time. In other words, they can switch that on, and they can use whatever bits are left as through which to organize the body. But they're using that secondary route for getting the body to do what it is that it does.
Could this be one of the areas in my last book I really got quite excited about, something called the calcium wave, and the way in which there seems to be evidence now that the brain works under non-local circumstances, and that somehow we're confusing the neurological model with the astroglial model, and the idea that the astroglial cells in some way can communicate non-locally with each other, whereas the neurons need the synapses and need the neurotransmitters to communicate. And you wonder whether that could be a kind of an overriding mechanism, maybe. It's intriguing because. But just going to make a final point, because I'm keen, because I've got your attention now. Is the other issue then is, could it be something to do with the amyloid plaques destroying the microtubules, during Alzheimer's that in some way facilitates that kind of secondary consciousness that you're talking about? You know, that it opens up the Bergsonian doors of perception? Or am I making 2 and 2 equal 23?
I think we're under constrained here, so we can say whatever we want. Right? I mean, if that was systematically true, then everybody would be having these lucid. All people with Alzheimer's
good
would
point.
be having these lucid. They don't. So there's no systematic kind of like process there. Something else that we don't understand.
I was reading about to get onto the idea of attention playing a part in this, and the fact that a lot of young people are now experiencing early onset dementia as a result of excessive screen use. And I think that, you know, what we do and where our attention is and what we do culturally and socially does impact on these kinds of experiences. Like, you look at the traditions in the ancient world, or the religions and the mystery rites and things like this. A non-corporeal dimension to reality was an accepted part, and it was something that they thought about all the time. And so if you think about something, then you're going to have these interesting anomalous experiences, you're going to have weird dreams, and you're going to have transcendental experiences quite often. And I think that if our attention is on the material, on the normal world, on the jobs and on the products that we buy, then we tend to have less experiences like that. And sometimes I think scientists often have less experiences, so they're not that interested in exploring them, because they're generally quite materialistic and conservative in their view of reality.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the ways for having access to these kinds of experiences is to loosen up and to stop thinking that we know everything and freezing everything into a particular format. One of my favorite, I come back to, you were mentioning, Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass. And I don't remember the exact quote, but it's, the Red Queen tells Alice how old she is. And Alice says, well, no way, I don't believe that. And the Red Queen says, why not? Alice, we just can't believe impossible things. And the Queen says, oh, you just haven't tried. You just have to try it. He said, why? I've believed 6 impossible things before breakfast. Mm-hmm. And so one of the exercises that a person can do is literally to make up a list of 6 impossible things. And while you're eating breakfast or before breakfast, see if you can believe it. And what happens if you believe it?
I think imagination is like horribly underrated, because imagination will create, me and Anthony talk all the time about, basically we've created culture out of our art and imaginings. And you look around on what culture is available these days, and on Netflix it's all apocalyptic films, dystopian visions of the future, and we are literally creating that reality through the media and the art that we create all the time. And people have to imagine, and they have to create beautiful visions of the future if that's what they want. And if I think culture is more significant to the general populace than science, because we're all feeling, seeing, thinking beings. We're not generally conducting scientific research. So actually, although science may make these claims about the way reality is, we experience reality based upon the culture that we're in and our personal experiences of it. I think there's a neuroscientist, I can't remember what neuroscientist is now. He says that if a dog walked into his office and was talking to him, that's all the evidence he would need to think that a dog could talk. And no number of scientific papers would ever convince him otherwise after he had actually experienced it.
I think that this raises a really important issue, and that is that by disregarding evidence for the non-local aspects of consciousness and for the possibility of the survival of consciousness after death, academia has done a disservice for itself, and it's lost its credibility with people. And when it loses its credibility with people, people stop looking to the academy for answers for any of these kinds of things, and maybe even for other things, then that opens up the opportunity for all kinds of crazy nonsense to be perpetuated. And I think that that's one of the real dangers that we have today, is that people go, well, science hasn't got it right because I already know, that they're missing all this stuff. So why should I pay attention to science? And then the alternative is now they will believe any crazy thing that comes along.
So true.
Just because a lot of the things I say are crazy doesn't mean that they haven't been carefully examined, or that I'm not willing to change my mind about them. That's the important part. But for most people out there, like, they just go, oh, well, okay, so this, maybe I'll just use these ideas for a while. This is how reality works, and they just go with it because they've lost their faith in science. And so I think that there is an actual danger, actual downside to the way in which science has approached all of this and pushing this materialist paradigm so hard for so long. The other one I see over and over again is that the meaninglessness in people that it encourages, because the universe is just this meaningless stochastic byproduct of something that nothing, as remember we talked about stripping any meaning or subjectivity or anything from it. That's all there is just this matter, and it's just bumping along in some kind of deterministic way, and there's no meaning in the universe. And so you have young people, cutting themselves, committing suicide or trying to commit suicide, ending up in emergency rooms across hospitals in Canada and also in the United States, probably in Europe, I would think as well, who have nothing psychiatrically wrong with them. They just don't know what to do. They're just confused. They have no purpose in life. They feel lost. They feel, and it's in large part because as an enlightened intellectual society from the academy outward, we're projecting this idea that there's no meaning or purpose or anything to anything because we believe in the materialist paradigm. And if you don't like it, here's some pills. Take these pills, to make you feel better. And so there are these ways in which this isn't just a fun game for academics to ignore the facts. It has real serious consequences, and they should wake up and start acknowledging that.
That is one of the most powerful statements I've heard in an awful long time regarding why it is that some elements of materialist reductionism and the present scientism model is dangerous. And I think I'm quite with you here. The danger is, as you rightly say, is that if people have experiences and they know these experiences are real, and then science denies them and says, you're just hallucinating. Hallucination, it's a label. It doesn't mean anything. They don't know what hallucinations are. And yet it makes somebody feel, well, I know I've experienced precognition. I know I've experienced precognitive deja vus, precognitive dreaming, out-of-body experiences, all these experiences. If science is in denial of them, these people then will, quite rightly, seek information elsewhere. And you're quite right. Then what happens is we end up with this rampant Dunning-Krugerism that we're all suffering from at the moment, where people will believe any nonsense because the science has painted itself into such a corner it can't get out. In which case, what it does is it then invalidates the positions of people like you and I and a lot of the people that have been guests on this show, because we're in the middle of this. We have the materialist reductionist one end throwing things at us. Then we have the Dunning-Kruger crew that believe everything throwing things at us. And we're in the middle of the bridge saying, hey guys, there is more to this. And I think your point there was very powerfully made about nihilism and the way in which, if we believe that the universe is literally just mechanical, it has no point, it has no purpose, and in fact we are just links in a genetic chain that exist for an immensely small amount of time in the overall idea of the universe, it's an existentialist crisis. And you're quite right, these kids, I never thought about it that before in that way. It's very dangerous, isn't it? Sarah, as you with a young daughter as well, you must be seeing this happening. It must worry you.
She's pretty chilled out, actually, because I talk about weird lucid dreams and things like that all the time. But actually, we haven't got a TV. and we don't really ever watch the news. And I don't really find myself getting overly concerned with the news or things like this. And I think that probably does make a bit of a difference to her stress levels. But I think that that is really true. Like when I was reading that article about early onset dementia and screens, I can see that, because your mind, you kind of go into a zombie mode when you look at a phone after a certain period of time. And you see kids doing it all the time these days. And if from babyhood, you know, people are quieting their kids now by literally giving them an iPhone, and they'll just be pushing them along with an iPhone on. Like what hope have they got of you know, really developing good memory skills and appreciation of the natural world around them, things like that? They're never going to get bored. They're just going to be distracted and occupied, and their attention is just kind of held by this screen, and there's no richness or depth to their experience. I think that dreams, near-death experiences, all of these transcendental experiences, meditation, they give you this richer appreciation of your sense of existence in the world and of having a spirit, and that starting to believe that we don't have souls or spirits is detrimental to the human race, I think.
Well, I mean, the things we've just discussed then, I think I'm quite staggered and very proud that we pulled such ideas together. Very quickly then, I mean, we're probably coming towards the end now and everything else. Imants, would you like to tell people about what work you're now involved in and your latest book and how that's doing? Oh, and a question I would love to ask, and I've always wanted to ask you this: how did you manage to convince the American Psychological Association to publish this book? Because I would imagine that would have been quite a tough job. But tell us about this and about your new book as well, and any new plans you've got.
Okay. Just one sec. So,
wow, okay.
So that's the second edition. I wrote the first edition in 2000, or started writing it, when was it? 2001, I think, something like that. I needed a textbook for my altered states of consciousness course. There was nothing out there that was good enough. And I already had a publishing contract from the University of Toronto Press, but I reached out to the American Psychological Association. I'm not too sure why, because I don't think I was expecting anything. And they sent the manuscript out to be refereed, which was very kind of them, and came back and said, the book is fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's too difficult for undergraduate students. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but this is what, I mean, I'm using my, the first version of the book was my lecture notes. I said, well, I'm already using it for teaching a general level university course that's open to all the students at the university without any prerequisites. So I'm sorry, but it's already an undergraduate course. So it took me 3 weeks of arguing with the acquisitions editor to convince her that undergraduate students would be able to read the book. And then they said, okay, and they signed a publishing contract with me. And the book, the first edition, was very successful. It was, and I used it for many, many years, obviously, and sold a lot of copies and got very good reviews. And so they were open, like APA Books was open to another book from me. And so when Julie and I started talking, we were just going to write a paper about time, and then we started saying, well, maybe we should write a whole book. That would be one chapter in the book. And that kind of matched together with the fact that APA Books was looking for a book from me. And so we sent them the prospectus, and literally we had none of it written, none. All we had was one paragraph describing what was going to be in each of the chapters. And they signed the publishing contract with us to write the book. So kudos to them. They then they haven't backed down in the face of, castigation. And I have no idea whether they had to deal with any of it or not. Certainly, I haven't seen anything. I mean, I think maybe one or two like comments somewhere about somebody saying, they should never publish this book, kind of thing. But I haven't seen any serious review of Transcendent Mind, written by anyone that has tried to bash it. It seems to me that the people who would be bashing it for some reason have backed off, and I don't know why. I'm not sure why. But so I'm just really, I've just been so glad that the APA has, been so kind to me and kept publishing my books. So all I can say is they've done a really marvelous job of it.
Mm.
They've always encouraged me. They've never tried to censor me. And so they would be like, I perceive them as an example of an academic and professional institution that is upholding academic integrity compared to most universities and departments and places around that are corrupt and that, not creating a stamp of Brian Josephson because, he's interested in telepathy. So that's corruption. So I mean, I guess that's the explanation. I was fortunate that they accepted the first edition. Now we've written the second one, of course. Just came out last July.
I must get hold of a copy of that. Right. Okay. Well, I can say what an astounding 2 hours. It was everything and more than I expected. And as with all of these broadcasts, we're now building up an incredible background material. And again, Imants, you might be quite interested in checking out some of the previous guests. I think particularly you would be very intrigued by the, as I say, the near-death experience of one of our previous guests, Will Merthyr, which would be really worth checking out and to see, and your interpretation of it as well. But as always, thanks for being such great fun, and thank you as well for being straight and making sure that we are on the right route in terms of our analysis as well, in terms of our collective research as well, because it's very important that the facts are correct and they have to be correct. And for instance, I thank you very much when you contacted me a few months ago pointing out about the latest research on the bicamerality of the human brain and, the idea of the left and right hemisphere, which was incredibly helpful for me, and I made extensive notes on that as well, which was very helpful. Okay, so thank you very much. Do you have a website or anything else that people can check out your work? Because I'm sure that after this, people will be interested in doing so.
It's just my last name, baruss.ca.
Excellent. Okay.
But is there anyone who has been listening who has a last minute observation or question? Or Sarah, have you been monitoring?
Yes, Sarah, have you got any there that people might want to?
Well, I have been monitoring them. They're mostly kind of comments rather than questions. Norman reckoned that you and Anthony are doppelgangers. Lots of people talking about NDEs that they've experienced or healing experiences. So a lot of just agreeing with stuff that you're talking about.
I think I've been, I mean, thanks to Anthony for inviting me to do this kind of thing, but I've been trying deliberately to do a little bit more of it, precisely to help people who are trying to rationalize and conceptualize what it is that's happened to them and put it into a broader framework and see how that framework can be a scientific framework and one that is supported by at least some academics.
I think that's
very important to do that.
That's such a wonderful point. I think that it's true that there should be somewhere where you can be supported scientifically without being given tablets to stop you having these unusual experiences. Because, for example, with hallucinations and like auditory phenomena, like hearing voices and stuff, there generally is just a kind of one strike approach to dealing with those sorts of situations, but actually in a broader context with the sorts of understanding that you're talking about, people could feel safe and looked after without being scared of these experiences, and using them in a kind of transpersonal psychological type of way?
Well, you have to always remember that about 11 to 13% of the population hears voices. 1% of the population has schizophrenia. Most of the people who hear voices are not mentally challenged. And they started gathering these data back in the 1800s. I think late 1800s, they started surveying people about hearing voices, and the numbers have remained fairly consistent since then, around 11 to 13%. So,
and of course, it's very important, isn't it? Over here in the UK, we have the Hearing Voices Network. And I visited them on a couple of occasions, particularly when I was doing research related to the work of Julian Jaynes, and I was quite intrigued carrying that forward to see how the Hearing Voices works. I think it was Marius Rom, I think is the guy. He's Dutch, I think, and they're very well worth checking out in terms of that. And of course, it dovetails in very, very nicely as well to our next guest next week, which will be Dr. Neil Rushton. And Neil, again, is a returning guest from Consciousness Hour. And Neil experiences very profound Charles Bonnet syndrome. And he's going to be discussing with us, and he's decided that, he really wants to come frank, although he's an academic himself, he's an archaeologist. He's very interested in talking to us about his experiences with Charles Bonnet syndrome. So this is really, really interesting. And I think that all of the shows now are like little pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And at some stage in the future, it would be really wonderful. I keep saying this, we get some kind of conference together with everybody, because the meeting of minds will be fantastic. And, it just humbles me, the amount of people I now know that I'm interfacing with, and how delighted I am to be able to bring these ideas out. And a very quick question, Imants. If anybody wanted to study with you, do you do any kind of study courses where people could study remotely, in your courses and things? Because your work is profoundly important, and should, just as a question, is there that facility available if anybody wanted to do that?
Well, everything's remote right now. So I actually have a student sitting in on one of the classes who is from Montana, student from Montana State University. We're not set up for that. We might be set up for that in the future. I'm trying to start an MA in Consciousness Studies at my university. We've been at it for 4 years. I have the faculty who will teach the courses, but the senior administration is just like dragging their feet, not answering emails, that kind of thing. So I don't think that will happen. I can supervise some graduate students in theory and criticism. So if people are interested in that, or other kinds of academic connections, they can try, they can see what's on my website and then contact me if they wish.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Okay, well, thank you again, everybody, for listening in.
I'd just say before you go, Wendy just asked, do you or Imants have any books that you would recommend as a sort of starting point for this sort of research? What would be your go-to first book?
Imants, over to you. I think Transcendent Mind, personally, but
I agree. I think Transcendent Mind is an overview of anomalous phenomena associated with consciousness. And if you don't understand that, then anything that you learn about consciousness isn't going to really be particularly useful. So that's a place to start. And the new book is really, it's like volume 2, basically. It's a follow-up on that book, because then I start getting into the more substantive material.
Yeah, no, I'd strongly.
There are all kinds of there are a lot of really good books out there.
Yeah, there are, but unlike a lot of them, what I like about your Transcendent Mind is that it is rigidly academic, and it's the kind of book that you will go back to again and again. It is a little bit expensive, but that's what academic books are. But in terms of a book that is
you need
just
a Consciousness Hour book club.
And,
yes, we do.
And this is also a good introduction because it's written for people who know nothing, right? So it's people who know nothing. It doesn't mean you can't know whatever you know, but I mean, it's written without assuming any background in neuroscience or psychology or anything. And it goes through all the different altered states of consciousness, including death, which has a section on near-death experiences.
Okay, what I will do is I'll post something about that up on my YouTube site as well. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for listening in. Been wonderful chat, and we'll see you all again next week. Okay, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Anthony.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thanks
Bye.
for doing this. Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.